Hello to my abnormal psych students. Today I'm going to be finishing my lecture on dissociative disorders. The one that's previous to this from a couple of days ago was on somatoform disorders. So this is the second half of that. I also wanted to just remind you, I'd sent you all emails about the third case study, which is you have a choice with this one. It is either dissociative identity disorder from the casebook or conversion disorder, hysterical blindness. So don't do both. It's one or the other. They're both really interesting. I did give you the date on that, and I don't remember it offhand. But if you look at your email from me, you'll see it. And let me ask you to continue to email me at my Gmail address. My college email is not working, and frankly, there's nobody I've been able to get in touch with from IT at the college to take care of that. So I hope you're all doing well, and got outside today, went for a nice run in the woods. Don't know about you, but I'm trying to get out at least a little bit. And so tonight, it is, let's see, it's 9:30 right now. I will be finishing this and then uploading it. But I'm going to do something I've wanted to do as a college professor for many, many years. I'm going to lecture and smoke a cigar. In my generation of undergrads, anybody who smoked, to show you how the culture's changed, if you were a smoker, cigarette, pipe, cigar, you'd smoke right in class. And I tell that to my young students now, and a lot of young students kind of think I might be joking, but it's actually the way it was. Talk about a shift in culture. So I had many college professors, of course, psych professors, the whole Freud thing, who would smoke cigars when they would teach. And in my world, I've never been able to do that because the culture changed, but tonight's my night. So, to get the lecture started, what am I supposed to talk about? Oh, yes, dissociation. Well, all right. So you all know that one of the themes of this course is that many psychological disorders are basically exaggerations of normal human behavior. And we're coming up with that same idea again when we talk about dissociation. Every one of us dissociates on a daily basis. Dissociation at one end of a spectrum is the most normal, natural thing that people do. So when you're in my class and you're bored out of your mind and you're daydreaming, right? Part of your awareness is still in the classroom, but another part of your mind has dissociated or disconnected and is lost in a daydream. Some of you might be dissociating right now, for all I know. Yeah, this feels right. Another example would be you get in your car, you drive 30 miles, and part of your mind was driving the car just fine, and another part of your mind was lost in some sort of alternate reality. So I don't want to pathologize dissociation. Dissociation is a very natural, normal way that we all use for a lot of reasons. It's a way to escape when we're bored or frustrated. It's a way to go sometimes to a place that's more interesting than where we might be. And it's also a way to cope with stress. Part of dissociation is it's a strategy to disconnect sometimes from things going on either around us or inside of us, upset emotions, stressful feelings, and it's a way of getting some space. So think of normal dissociation at one end. Oh boy. At one end of the continuum, and then all the way at the other end of the continuum are dissociative disorders. In a dissociative disorder, the ability to stay connected to yourself, to the world around you, is significantly impaired. So mild dissociation, join the club. It's actually a coping strategy, but severe dissociation is a different deal. So just consider the word dissociation and think about what that means. In ordinary English, dissociation is a way of checking out. It's a way of mentally checking out from either something we're feeling, if we're anxious or we're angry or we're having a bad memory, right? We're dissociating or checking out from that inner experience. It can also be a way of checking out when things around us are troubling to us. So now, we actually talked about dissociation early in the semester when we covered PTSD. Many folks with PTSD will dissociate, and it becomes one of the symptoms. And you can imagine how, even though it's a symptom, that this kind of makes sense. It's a way of coping with upsetting re-experiencing of traumatic events. There are also other psychological disorders separate from dissociative disorders in which dissociation is a significant component. An example of that would be the borderline personality disorder. Folks who struggle with borderline issues were frequently traumatized and abused, either physically or sexually, or certainly emotionally, early in life. And they basically learned this as a strategy to escape from very painful and terrifying situations. But we're going to look tonight at 3 different dissociative disorders. The first one is called dissociative amnesia. The second one is called dissociative amnesia with fugue. It's sometimes just called dissociative fugue. And the third one, which is the famous one that there's been more movies and books written about than practically any other disorder, is dissociative identity disorder, aka DID. And I think you probably all know that it was once called multiple personality disorder, and you'll still see that term used kind of in the common language. So to understand DID, you really need to first understand dissociative amnesia, because it's dissociative amnesia that underlies the development of dissociative identity disorder. I'm wearing my Pink Floyd shirt for obvious reasons. There he is, the great Sigmund. Actually, Sigmund Freud had a lot to say about the process of dissociation. Some of our modern understanding of it really goes back over 100 years. Let me start with dissociative amnesia, and let's just consider the word amnesia. Amnesia by itself means loss of memory. And most types of amnesia are really not dissociative amnesia. Most frequently, when somebody experiences a memory loss, it is not dissociative amnesia. It is called organic or physical amnesia. Organic means of the body. You all know, some of you may have experienced this if you've ever had a concussion, where what happens is you experience some head trauma, some brain trauma, and you have a memory lapse for a period of time before and sometimes after the injury, right? So in a concussion or hitting your head on a steering wheel, those are examples not of dissociative amnesia, but organic or physical amnesia. Dissociative amnesia is actually less common, but it certainly happens. And what's happening in dissociative amnesia is that a person, in response to something very upsetting, either in them or around them, or a combination of both, mentally dissociates. They mentally shut down their memory processing system. Now, in dissociative amnesia, you're not asleep, you're not unconscious. You may look to an outsider, somebody looking at you, like you're functioning normally, but you are not storing the memories in the same way that you do when you're not experiencing dissociative amnesia. And so let's think about defense mechanisms for just a minute, right? Early in the semester, we talked about different strategies that the mind uses automatically. They're called ego defense mechanisms to deal with things that we can't handle. And that goes back to the famous quote of Freud, quote, "You can't handle the truth." There are many different types of defense mechanisms. The defense mechanism that's operating in dissociative amnesia is fundamentally repression. Think of dissociative amnesia as an over-reliance and an overuse of the defense of repression. So very quickly, in one way to psychodynamically, there's the conscious mind, the things that we are aware of above the surface, and there's this larger, powerful unconscious mind. And all of us, to some extent, have certain conscious experiences that are feelings or images that are upsetting, and we repress them. We bury them in the unconscious. Now, you know the deal with the unconscious. The expression is gone but not forgotten. Even if I can't consciously remember something, if that data, those feelings, those memories, those thoughts, whatever they are stored in my unconscious, they're still there, and they're kind of going to get me through the side door instead of me being aware of them through the front door, so to speak. So in dissociative amnesia, there's a significant amount of repression of certain sorts of experiences that are very disturbing to that given individual. Now, we all differ a little bit, right? I might not need to repress certain experiences as much as you, because we're different people, different personalities. We had different childhood experiences. You might have been more traumatized than I was. There's a whole bunch of different factors that are involved in this. So in dissociative amnesia, a person is repressing something that's got a lot of emotional charge to it. And we're going to divide dissociative amnesia into two types: episodic, which is number one, and number two, what is called timeline dissociative amnesia. Episodic is more common. In episodic dissociative amnesia, there are particular episodes that somebody has experienced that they have repressed. They still have a sense of time passing, 2 in the afternoon, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, next day after that. But there are certain emotionally traumatic episodes that have been buried and moved into the unconscious. So imagine somebody who is flooded with rage, and they're not okay with that rage. They feel very ashamed or guilty about that rage, or the anger that they're feeling scares them. If it's toward another person, they're scared that they may act on it in horrible sorts of ways. In that example, a person might have buried the actual episode of when they felt that emotion, right? So they might not even remember that they had a conversation with somebody 2 days ago and they felt this. At that moment, they felt this burst of rage. The whole thing might be buried. There's a second type of dissociative amnesia, which is less common, but very interesting. It's called timeline dissociative amnesia. And in timeline, an entire chunk of time, could be minutes, could be hours, occasionally longer, everything in the boundary of that two edges of time is completely gone. This would be an example of somebody who looks at their watch, it's 3 in the afternoon. They look at their watch again. In their experience, it's only a few minutes later, and it's now 7 in the evening, and there's 4 hours of their timeline that's completely vanished. Some of you may remember a story that I shared with you regarding somebody that I knew, a client of mine many years ago, who experienced this timeline dissociation. And it always happened. It never happened on the weekends. It only happened if it was going to happen at all, Monday through Friday. And his timeline dissociation would always be pretty much the same. It would kick in around 3 in the afternoon, and then his memory would kind of come back online around 6:30 in the evening. And long story short, it turned out that these timeline dissociative episodes were correlated with him abusing a little girl that he was responsible for. And of course, if you think about what was going on, if you can't remember it, if it's all been buried in your unconscious, then it's as if to your conscious mind it didn't even happen, so there's nothing to feel ashamed or guilty about. And also, the horrible truth is, when you bury stuff like that, because you can't remember it, you actually sometimes continue to do it, right? Timeline dissociative amnesia is almost always tied to certain traumatic experiences or actions, and that's why that chunk of time is repressed. Now, if you were a therapist and somebody showed up your office with symptoms of timelines or blackouts, right? The first thing you would not jump to is dissociative amnesia. There are far more likely probabilities, and I bet you've already thought about some of them, right? Are there a lot of drugs that people can take that produce essentially blackouts, where loss of memory, right? But again, they're not dissociative. Those are organic because it's actually physically affecting your brain. Alcohol, of course, is the best known of all of them. There are other possibilities. Might somebody with certain sorts of physical problems in their brain, the development of dementia, for example, have these sorts of timeline dissociations where their memory shuts down for a period of time, right? Could it be related to an underlying seizure disorder where the seizures are not being controlled? So dissociative amnesia is kind of like a diagnosis of exclusion, where you look at the more likely probabilities first and then you rule them out. And if you can rule out the organic stuff, then you begin to think about a psychological disconnect, a psychological amnesia. But again, the thing to take away here is it's a strategy. It's a dissociation. Dissociative amnesia is a psychological tool. It's used automatically. It's used unconsciously. You don't know you're doing it, but it's all about escaping from upset, from tremendous conflict. Okay, so that's number one. That then takes us to number two, which is called either dissociative fugue. It's also sometimes called dissociative amnesia with fugue. And the word fugue, those of you who are musicians might recognize the word fugue. In French, fugue means flight, to flee, right? Dissociative fugue is extremely rare. This is very uncommon, but it does happen. And what happens, it's really a two-step process. In dissociative amnesia with fugue, step one is a person develops dissociative amnesia. Step two is they then flee fugue to another location. There are these stories, rare though that they are, of somebody who's found wandering aimlessly thousands of miles from home. They vanished a month ago. And when they're found, they have some symptoms almost of delirium. They don't know who they are. They don't know where they are. The story that they tell to explain themselves is just full of gaps. It doesn't make any sense. And, it winds up, the person vanished weeks or months ago from another location. And this would be an example of fugue. Now, why? So here's what people have trouble understanding. How could you get from A to B hundreds of miles away and not know how you got there? To understand that, you've got to go back to the original definition of what dissociation is. Part of your mind is on that journey, and another part of your mind is dissociated or split and doesn't know about that journey that you're on. It is an extreme example of what I said earlier to you, which is driving a car 30 miles. Part of your mind is driving the car, and another part of your mind is dissociated, experiencing an entirely different reality inside your head, right? It's an extreme form of that. But if you think about fugue, in a funny sort of way, it kind of makes sense, right? If I develop dissociative amnesia and I continue to live my life in the same geographical location that I've lived my life, are there going to be a lot of cues in my environment that are going to trigger me to reconnect to my story of who I am and what's going on, right? And so, if I continue to live in Wantage, New Jersey, I'm going to see things. I'm going to see people that remind me of my story. I'm going to see locations. I'm going to see cows, all kinds of things that are going to remind me of where I live. Right? But if I go to another location 500 miles away, will there be far fewer memory cues and therefore far fewer triggers to reconnect me to my real self, right? One way to think of fugue is an attempt to change your environment so you can hold on to your dissociative amnesia longer. And I think, in some sort of funky way, it's kind of like the ultimate fantasy that people have when our lives are not working well, which is I'm going to, somehow forget everything about the life I've lived and I'm going to start over somewhere else. Not doable in real life, but I get the understanding of it. There are some Alfred Hitchcock movies that work the theme of fugue. It's such an interesting sort of split. It's such a powerful example of that split. But again, it's rare. Okay, so this takes us to the big one, which the third disorder, DID, dissociative identity disorder, used to be called multiple personality disorder. So let me start by just clarifying something. One thing that people often confuse, and it's kind of built into the culture, is people often put an equal sign between schizophrenia and DID. They are two different disorders. In years past, as recently as the 1980s, there was some diagnostic confusion between those two disorders. And part of that confusion is schizophrenia is sometimes thought to be split personality, which sounds exactly like DID. We're going to cover schizophrenia at the end of the semester, and it's a different disorder. Schizophrenia is a thought disorder. It's a cognitive disorder. It's a developmental disorder, and it's neurodevelopmental. Things go wrong both genetically and in the development of the brain early in life. A person who's schizophrenic has many different symptoms, but those symptoms are fundamentally of a thinking or a cognitive nature. DID, aka MPD, is different. In DID, there are two or more, almost always more, separate identities housed within the same individual. So in dissociative identity disorder, a person develops two or more, and the average is significantly greater than two, separate ways of remembering and thinking and handling emotions and relating to other people, right? But again, consider the main premise of this course. Most psychological disorders are exaggerations of normal human behavior. I think one of the reasons we're so fascinated by DID is it touches something in all of us that we can relate to, right? Have you ever found yourself in the weird position of having a conversation at 9 in the morning with a particular individual in your life, and you're saying something and you're feeling it and you're thinking hard about it and it's right and you're speaking your truth. And then 12 hours later, 9 p.m. after a long day, you're in a different mood than you were, you're thinking differently, your emotions are different. Saying something 12 hours later that completely contradicts what you so vehemently were saying 12 hours earlier, right? In other words, the you that was being experienced at 9 in the morning and the you that's being experienced at 9 in the evening are not exactly the same, right? Or another example, think of if I followed you around for a week That would be illegal, and actually very creepy to even think about that. If I oh boy, if I followed you around for a week and videotaped 1 week of your life, and then I edited that videotape down to an hour documentary about you, could I edit the videotape in such a way that you would be seen acting and talking and experiencing and emoting in very different ways, right? When you're hanging out with your grandma, do different parts of your personality emerge than if it's 2 a.m. and you're at a party with your best sets of friends, right? When you're sitting in a college classroom, do you think and feel and relate differently than when you're in the cafeteria, right? From one point of view, we all have a little bit of DID. Here's the difference. I know that my moods change, my memories change, my thinking changes. To some extent, what I believe to be true can change in me place to place, day to day. But I experience it as all part of me. In other words, I have what's called a meta, M-E-T-A, right? A meta self. People without DID have a meta self. They have a sense they can see their own contradictions, and they have a sense that even though all of these things don't always work smoothly together, they're all a part of me, my one self, a unified self. People with DID did not develop that inner sense of unity among the different pieces of themselves.